than for kind of cross talk during the meeting. Okay, with that, should we kick off? Apologies for absence first item. I have two, Harvey Odds and Claire Potter, who's on holiday. There's no others, I think.
I have no other apologies, Chair.
Yeah. So let's kick off declarations of interest. I'm assuming there are none. And Michelle usually comes in at this stage, but I don't know. She said she's accepted, so I'm expecting her, but we'll take that as read. The third item is minutes of the previous meeting. And first of all, I haven't had any notification of incorrect. Yeah, Anna?
Nick, I just thought the capital programs deep dive, does that cover regeneration projects?
Well, let's come to that. Yeah, I mean, that's a very good
only because it's in my declarations of interest, but could I just formally declare that even though he's not a spouse, but my brother does have a contract with the council for a regeneration project, just to be absolutely transparent.
Yeah, no, that's a good, well made. And Michelle, welcome.
Yeah.
We're just on declarations of interest, and I know you usually come in at this stage.
Yes, hi, I'm on the board of a TMO in Hackney. Thanks.
Great. Okay, we'll note both those, and thanks for those. Right, minutes of the last meeting. Unless I have any indication of incorrect minutes, we'll take those as read. And we've also had the matters arising or actions that followed, and again, Peter distributed those, and they all have been covered. So I think they're all either done or in the process of being done, I think is the summary. Okay, well, let's move on to the next item, and in a sense it's the core of this meeting, because the fast-moving changes on finance are absolutely crucial, and the audit has a central oversight issue in circumstances like this. And just to remind people, I think audit responsibility covers two things in the present situation. One is, given the undermining of our income, which I'm sure Ian can talk more about in a minute, there is a number of councils who are concerned about this year's going concern, i.e. can they get through this year and hit their budgets. And that's one absolutely core briefing that we need as an audit committee to be assured that we're not in that we can get through this process. I think both the executive in the shape of Rebecca and Ian in terms of our financial advice have reassured us that there are no immediate issues on that, but we do need to, and one of the items we need to go through is the paper on our current finances, which Ian will take us through. But I think broadly I would summarise that as being reassuring. The other aspect of audit responsibility lies in having adequate plans in place to cope with the expected issues that will arise from the budget changes. And there, obviously, we're focusing on the issue of the 21-22 budget. And again, the executive, I think, very helpfully has put in a process by which they're keeping us informed about when they're approaching that, and involving us in that to reassure us that that is being tackled. But those are the two issues that I think audit has a real important oversight, and to be reassured that the executive on behalf of the council is both solvent and is coping with the expected budget shortfalls over the next medium term. And maybe Rebecca, you can come in at some point and say something a bit about how you're going about this process of involvement. We'll come back to that anyway. So that's in place. So the three areas we want to sort of cover off this evening are, first of all, Ian to cover two of those major issues, which is current year both on the general fund and the HRA, that we are able to do that. And we've got one of the papers summarising that and how we're coping with that. And Ian will take us the latest update on that. And then secondly, the issue about the next year's budget, the priorities that are emerging, and the numbers that are likely to emerge there to see, so we know what the scale of the challenge is. And then, as I say, the third section of this is the executive response. What immediate things have we put in place to ensure that we're minimising any dangers of budget problems, and what are we putting in place to cope with the medium term that the council will be faced with. So just to pause there before Ian starts us off, any questions or issues around that immediately? If not, then Ian, do you want to sort of take us through that sort of those two key issues from your side?
So thank you and good evening everybody. What I've done, Chair, is I've done a presentation really that tries to summarise a lot of the detail that's contained within the two substantive papers that came out with the agenda, so we can maybe use that as a way to update people on the two questions that you've asked. I've also included on the final slide just an update on where we are with the accounts process as well, which is obviously the next item on the agenda, but we can come to that separately. So just bear with me a moment and I'll get this presentation up and running. Always where am I? So then, are we there? Fingers crossed. Right, hopefully people can see the screen. Is that okay? Great stuff.
Yep, all that's there. Thanks, Ian.
Great stuff. So I'm going to run through a quick update on where we are in terms of latest announcements, latest financial position for the current financial year. And then I'm going to give you an update on where we are in terms of the medium-term forecast. Obviously, you've got a substantive paper on that in the agenda pack, but what I'll do is I'll draw out the highlights of it. And then finally, so before we'll go on to an update on where we are with the audit of the accounts. So, what is the position as we sort of sit here now? The latest position that we have is that for the current financial year, so that's the 2021 financial year, in terms of the general fund, we've now received the third tranche of funding from government in terms of the monies they've allocated to local authorities for this crisis. That totaled across the country £500 million, and it built upon the two tranches of £1.6 billion that were allocated out very much at the outset of the pandemic, but then also through May as well. So in total, Hackney's received just over £21.3 million across the three tranches. The third tranche was a total £3.5 million. Interestingly, to look in detail at how that tranche of funding was actually distributed, it seemed to draw upon some of the indices and indicators that might feed into a future fairer funding formula, but particularly drew out some aspects around deprivation, and that saw London and Hackney get a slightly better distribution than we'd had under the first two tranches of funding. We've also now had detailed confirmation of what's called the compensation for loss of income scheme that the government's looked to put in place, because as you outlined, Councillor Sharman, at the start, it's not just extra spend that councils are incurring, they're actually seeing significant drops in their income across the board, so not just the ones you would expect, like council tax, like business rates, like housing rents, but also fees and charges in the space of parking, obviously leisure centres, on-street trading, commercial waste, the whole litany of charges that you're all very familiar with, having seen the detailed appendices that go up with the budget every year as part of fees and charges. And in that scheme, they announced a particular type of compensation package. It took quite a lot of discussion with officials, it's probably fair to say, to get them to appreciate the fact that actually it's the losses of income that's actually hitting councils as hard as expenditure in a very different way to, say, something like the NHS. But just in terms of summary, and I appreciate this is fleshed out in more detail in the OFP report and in the medium-term forecast, the compensation for loss of income scheme effectively looks to say to local authorities, well, the first 5% of any loss compared to budgeted income is on your risk, because actually, you know, if you're going to generate income, there's always going to be some degree of fluctuation, and they felt that it was not unreasonable to include as effectively a starting point that said you always have to absorb some risk. And then they go on to say for what remaining aspect of that you have lost, so not necessarily 75 pence of the total budget that remains, it's actually what income you have actually lost. And so that again says for every pound of budget effectively you've lost in terms of budget, after taking off the 5% discharge, you'll get 75 pence of that back. That doesn't apply to the next bullet point, which is called collection fund deficits. And members of this committee will be familiar with that term from the annual statement of accounts. Collection funds are something which we maintain in relation to council tax and in relation to business rates. And what they've said with those income streams is, given that it's not impossible that actually people may in future years look to pay back council tax, as we often see and have for many years had people, when they have got into difficulty, say for example they might have had a short-term life crisis, lost their job or something, they haven't been able to pay, but actually then when they've got themselves back on their feet and been able to pay, we've been able to recover that over future years. And that's the sort of principle that the government's looking to apply to council tax and to business rates. And I suppose the important point for the committee to appreciate is the criticality of the collection fund to the setting of next year's budget. So traditionally, and under current legislation, the collection fund has to be made good before the start of the next financial year, and that's why one of the core building blocks of every budget setting process is the report that Councillor Ennison takes to full council ultimately every January, setting out our assumptions on our tax base, our expected levels of collection, but also where we feel the collection fund will end up for the forthcoming financial year's start. I think looking at all the numbers, you know, not just in Hackney but across the country, it's quite clear that local authorities are accruing and are going to have deficits in place. And it's not unlikely they will be quite substantial, and to a level of which to try and remedy it in 1 year would be too much of a hit on budgets going forwards. So what the government suggested it's going to do, and again we await legislation for this, because what they need to do is tie it into the correct financial year in terms of government planning cycles, and because it falls into next year, it's obviously part of a comprehensive spending review. But what they've indicated to us through correspondence is that those deficits can be spread over the following 3 financial years equally. And following that announcement, it was interesting, I thought anyway, that the Secretary of State, when at MHCLG Select Committee last week, actually gave the indication that, having looked in more detail at the challenges authorities are facing in relation to collection fund deficits, they may now give some thought to bringing in a more immediate compensation scheme for losses of council tax and business rates, which I think, you know, we would certainly welcome here. And finally, the other bit of news we had recently was finally got our allocation confirmed for what's called the Local Authority Emergency Assistance Grant for Food and Essential Supplies. So you'll probably recall this in part started in the discussions at Prime Minister's question times over things like you know, food for people over the summer holidays. What we've been allocated is £427,000 to enable us to put together a package of support to assist people over that critical period from the 1st of August. So I'll pause there for any questions at this point. I can only see a handful of you on the screen, so I'll sort of be guided by
yeah, I'll let you know, Ian, if I'm getting any.
That's okay. That's
yeah.
So I can't see anyone indicating, so I'll progress on to the next.
No, carry on. Yeah.
Okay. So what we've got to do here is summarise basically from what was in the OFP. So you'll see that in the pack here. The latest general fund outturn position for 2021, and what we've tried to do here is distill it in terms of what we've seen as the overall position, and more critically, the non-COVID, COVID distinction of that. And you can see there how the numbers flow. from a forecast overspend gross of just over £60 million, or just under £61 million for the general fund. That then, within that, we identified just under £2 million of what we think are non-COVID activity. So that would overspend we would have expected to have had, well, that we can attribute to non-COVID factors. And moving down the columns there, you can see how we've taken out the impact of council tax and business rates because of the treatment that's being proposed around the collection fund and the deficits there, to give us what we've termed in this language is our net overspend position. We then are looking to apply the emergency government funding to that overspend position. So again, you'll recognise the £21.3 million there. And then what we've looked to do is do a very initial estimate of what we think we are likely to be able to draw down on from government in relation to the compensation for loss of income stream. I would caveat this in a number of ways though. Firstly, whilst we've had more detailed guidance on how the scheme will operate, there are some lines in it that go on to say, obviously, there may be some degree of sampling in terms of an audit of some of the claims that are put in. Their indication at the moment is that they are happy to rely upon Section 151 officers, so in Hackney's case myself, certifying that the submissions are reasonable. But one of the bits of clarity that I've been seeking is some understanding of actually when will these payments be triggered in terms of, it's probably fair to say at this point that 9.5 million estimate is our estimate for the year forecast. What we don't know is how things will exactly play out by the 31st of March 2021. And so what I'm wanting to get confirmation of is when we will have some degree of comfort that those monies will be paid across to us, so that we can have some certainty that they're going to come forwards, and officials are working hard to come back to us with clarity on that as well. So hopefully you've stuck with us so far on this slide to take us down to what I've called here the remaining shortfall, so just over £9 million for the general fund. And we're looking at pressures of around £8 million or so on the housing revenue account as well, which obviously isn't included in this slide, but is detailed more separately in the report. So that gives you a handle really on where we are as a current financial year forecast and position. And what I've been doing, working closely with Councillor Renison, corporate management team, my teams on this call, is look to identify ways by which we could look to continue to mitigate some of that having an impact in the current year. But I think you can see by the scale of it that it's of an order of magnitude that is much better than when we first were looking at forecasts of £60 million with no certainty of what government was going to do about treating collection fund deficits, what it was going to do around compensation for loss of income, what it was going to do around emergency funding. And there's a number of pieces of work I've also got underway with the team to look at, to see how we can continue to bear down on some of those forecasts, to see whether there's opportunities to sharpen them up in some cases, particularly where we've had to estimate expenditure into the future to see whether that is all necessarily needed, because obviously any expenditure we forecast that we don't incur will assist in drawing down that shortfall a bit. And likewise, if we're able to see improvements in income positions, maybe as aspects of the economy pick up, for example, we might see some improvements there as well. So I'll pause there maybe.
Yeah, Ian, do you just want to say a little bit about what the 1.9 is? That additional pressures, budget pressure? Because I'm just very aware that we've got a send overhang, which is dealt with later in the paper. Does that include that?
No, that pressure there doesn't include the SEND. That's just some early forecasts of some demographic pressures coming through in the areas that we're trying to say we don't think at this stage are COVID, but in some of the cases it's quite a fine line in terms of distinguishing, is it genuinely COVID, is it not? But that's just generally what we're forecasting at this point.
Any members want to come in? I mean, I think this is still a substantial number, not least because you're saying some of it moved over into subsequent years. So
Yes.
it's not a place it's still a challenge. Is what I say.
And I think the bit that certainly Councillor Renson and I have been speaking about is the fact that, you know, should we be able, and you know, and we will, of course we will manage through this current year, and we'll come on to talk about that in a bit more detail. But actually, what it does do is it erodes ever more our flexibilities going forwards and our rooms to manoeuvre. So it shouldn't be just seen as a no pain solution, because ultimately, you know, the things that have enabled Hackney to be the great council that it is, to do the great things it does, have been because we've had some degrees of financial flexibility to innovate, to do things, to try things, to sometimes do upfront invest to save things. All of, you know, one of the big impacts of COVID will be a tightening of our flexibilities and our ability to just you know, invest and try things.
Yeah. Can I just one other point? I do think it's important in terms of looking ahead for the remaining part of this year, that we can be reassured as an audit committee that we have put in place immediate measures to ensure that we've done everything we can, taking account of the fact that the bigger issue, which we'll come on to, is how we address the longer term issue. And I know Rebecca wants to come in, but I guess it's worth just saying, Ian, a little bit about how we're managing the immediate issues as we face this £10 million or £9 million potential.
So one of the exercises I kicked off very early on in this process was to make sure that, you know, where there may have been expenditure which we would have incurred in normal times, could we look to capture that where it's not being incurred? Now that will include a range of things, from the very sort of trivial, I'm going to say there might have been roadshow events, sessions held to meet greet with the public, things that would have happened in normal times, conferences, you know, the whole range of things, essential car allowances, mileage allowances, the sorts of things that you can all predict. To look to see, could we look to try and capture some of those to bring into our forecast, and the piece of work being done on that. But in addition to that, also looking closely at our agency spend budgets, again, where we think there are there opportunities to pare back some of the costs in that space, and also look very closely at the capital programme as well, to see if there are any schemes, particularly where it involves using our monies, where we can either look to slow down some of the schemes, or in some cases pause and reflect, where they may no longer be as relevant as they were in a pre-COVID world, because the world has moved on.
Great. Yes, Anna, you wanted to ask a question.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's just picking up just quickly what Ian just said then about workforce, because I know myself, the NHS, believe it or not, have been able to capture some savings, because some hospitals were they actually had quite a lot of empty beds in the end, because of the impact of COVID. Fortunately, wasn't as bad as they expected, particularly on those wards and those areas where they had elective work, which was obviously put on hold during COVID. So it would be quite interesting, because I suspect the workforce is quite a big percentage of the overall budget of the council, to know what work is going on, because I suspect, whilst the other councillors would agree, we are quite concerned, and I think the council generally is quite concerned around the new types of people that will be coming to the council for support. There's another group of people that probably haven't been doing as much, not as much work, but the fact that you've been able to redeploy staff, it sounds quite a difficult thing to look at, but essentially I know within the NHS we've started to look at areas that people have easily been redeployed into new roles, and it's started to get people to think about whether or not, if they had gaps in before, whether or not they needed to still be filled. So I just wondered what's happening with your recruitment as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole issue about
the whole thing of workforce is really key, because I suspect your workforce is been business as usual. Obviously, it's not been. I suspect you have had to spend quite a lot, because you unfortunately have staff sick. But I just think there's probably some back office, which is not to discredit anything that isn't front line, because But I suspect there's something that, like the nice things that would be nice to do, and it links to what you were saying about the whole deep dive, is that there will be projects that we might have to put on hold, and there's a whole group of workforce that are associated to that as well. I'm just putting it out there.
Right. Okay. Got the question. Can we get Ian to give an answer?
Yeah, sure. No, I think that's exactly the sort of thinking which I've been sort of raising with the corporate management team to see where there were opportunities for us to repurpose. I suppose what's been most interesting in this sort of whole journey for us really has been that, you know, often, and I know if Rob was with us today, he hates the term back office, front office, because in his mind, you know, IT is often referred to as a back office service, but actually it's so integral, isn't it, to front office. We've got a visitor on Audit Committee. It's so integral to the delivery of all frontline services. So we try and move away from that exactly. But yes, if you take as an example, the fact that all of our call centres have been able to be consolidated into one, and now are fully working from home almost, and that I forget exactly how quickly that was done, but it was literally in a matter of days. It certainly wasn't weeks, and that's led to a completely different piece of thinking around how we use the corporate estate. What will people come back to? And actually, is it desirable? Because it was quite interesting looking at the feedback we had from staff when we've done our pulse surveys. And actually, yes, there are people who miss not being in the office, but actually an overwhelming theme coming across is that actually people have really given greater thought to how they can redefine their roles and actually work more productively from home. A good example of that is one of Councillor Ennison's major services is the housing benefits team. What we've actually seen with that team working from home even more so, and the other good example would be David Omni's revenues team, which have had to sort of go a complete volte-face in terms of what they normally do, which is collect money, but actually in terms of business rates, pay it out, which was quite a change of direction for them. But again, they've been able to utilise the great technologies that we've got in place here, the great platforms we have, to actually completely redefine the roles and working. And I think actually how we repurpose and redefine the workforce and the work that Councillor Williams has been doing on the workforce strategy is actually going to be something that's going to be absolutely key. And I'd suggest probably something this committee would want to take a bigger interest in going forwards as well, because as you rightly said, Councillor Lynch, our employee spend is probably the biggest of our, if you block spend down, if you exclude housing benefit payments, of course, but if that's not in it, then it is what we spend on staff, paying people, and by definition, commission as well.
Chair, can I just jump in, Chair? Because I always have to follow up whenever we mention workforce and staff, just to be very clear. One, that any changes we bring in need to be done and will be done in consultation with staff, so people won't just come back and find everything's changed. And when we also we can feel quite detached when we talk about workforce, and I agree with Rob as well on front line and back line. It's all essential services. That as we come out of this, and Councillor Williams is doing fantastic work on this, the workforce are central, and supporting the staff that got us through this is central. And I suppose we could identify workforce as our biggest spend, is also our biggest asset. And so just aware that sort of these meetings now have a much bigger audience now. They're streamed and online and everything else, not wanting anyone concerned sort of us talking about workforce and costs. That indicates the direction of travel. It's our commitment to our staff is very clear. They've got us through this, and we want to support them as we move into the next phase. So sorry, Chair, I know that's not necessarily audit, but I want to jump in and get that in there.
No, very, very good point, Rebecca. Can I just pursue that a stage further? Not on the workforce, because I think you made that point very clearly, but the other controls that you and Ian are putting together in order to ensure that we have done everything in the short term. We'll come on to the kind of medium-term issues that we've been tackling together, but it's just a reassurance that we've got in place the best possible controls to minimise the issues that we're going to face.
I mean, it's I suppose a dual process. So one I'll reassure you on, and the other might be something audit wants to come back to at a future date. So on the reassurance point, we've got the overall financial position, which we know it's on the audit paper tonight, and we'll be reporting all our COVID spend and changes in that part of that. So that'll be coming forward pretty much monthly. So that's very transparent there for everyone to see. We're happy to come back and update audit. It goes to scrutiny panel already. So that's a very clear, transparent track mechanism. The other thing that and in the medium-term financial plan, I hesitated slightly because there's so many papers at the moment. But in the update to the medium-term financial plan, we've got the measures that Ian's talked about some of the short-term things, which making sure that we really understand those numbers. So Ian touched on them in his presentation. We might be preempting what he's about to come to as well, but things like keeping a track on things like agency spend, still bottoming out. We're still learning on some of the COVID figures about the impact on income, what that might look like, how that plays out over the rest of the year. So it might be something whether we incorporate it into the OFP narrative or something to come back to audit on, but we can talk through those perhaps in a few months' time and report and see what we've learned from that process. But Ian, I don't know if you'd add to that.
I think I echo all of those comments. The other things I just also mention is that we have, again, looked closely with colleagues on the management team at delegation levels as well. So again, the sorts of things you'd expect us to be looking at in terms of, really making sure that, for example, whether it's some of the single tender actions that have been previously awarded, just tightening up the general sort of financial control management environment.
I think that's a helpful reassurance. And I think Rebecca's point here is absolutely crucial, that we have regular reports on how we're doing. So if there are problems, they're spotted early. And that, to me, is what good management in these sort of situations has got to be founded on. So I think it'd be very helpful. I mean, we're going to have another audit in September because of the accounts coming back. I think it'd be very helpful just to add an item to that on picking up on the monitoring you're doing and saying how we're doing, just to sort of reassure you that we're going in the right direction. Okay, thanks for that, Ian. Let's move on then to take us forward.
So this sort of moves us neatly on to the sort of next item, if you like, on the report around the medium-term financial forecast and the work we've been doing to try and get a handle on what we think future financial positions could look like, given all the uncertainties, the complexities, and the things that we don't know. So middle of last week, we found out some more information. The first of that was that the Chancellor has now confirmed there's going to be a 2020 spending review, and that's going to run for 3 financial years in relation to revenue spend and 4 financial years in relation to capital spend. And I've set out the years there, so through to 23-24 revenue, 24-25 for capital. Opportunities for local authorities and for Hackney to submit representations, as always, in relation to the spending review, and you'll not be surprised to hear that we do intend to do that. And work is already well underway in relation to that. We also had some further information around, again, subjects which, again, this council's done an awful lot of work on in terms of business rates and our frustrations at times with business rates as a form of tax, in terms of its the way that it doesn't do many of the things it needed to do previously, and also the fact that it still suffers from that long delay in the last revaluation. And members will remember that Hackney saw the biggest increase in its rateable value of any London borough. But what we have now found out is that there is going to be a call for evidence for the business rates review, so a fundamental review of business rates, and I suspect an awful lot of that will be linked to issues in the high street, again, of which people will be all familiar. It'll be quite technical, we understand, in terms of some of the detail it requires, because obviously business rates as a national tax collects an awful lot of tax for the economy. They've also announced that business rates revaluation, the next revaluation, will take effect on the 1st of April 2023, so that the feeling is that it will better reflect the impact of COVID-19, and it will be based upon property values as of the 1st of April 2021. So again, a bit more detail there. I think that the points I would just not want members to be unsighted on in relation to business rates is though the fact that in the current financial year, in addition to the substantial amounts of grants we've paid out to businesses to effectively keep them going, and we've paid out best part of £70 million in actual physical grants now to businesses, we've also awarded substantial sums of what's called business rate reliefs, so effectively where the bill gets reduced, for want of a better word, and the latest amounts of reliefs that we've paid out are around £50 million. Now, I think we can all see when we go out that whilst the economy is starting to reopen up again in Hackney, whether it's in the retail, hospitality, leisure sector, it is still not opening up to the levels that it was back in pre-COVID worlds, either due to people not being out as much, not having as much money to spend, but also from the impact of having to put in place different arrangements to socially distance in restaurants, in pubs and the like. So the double whammy for businesses will be they're having less income and higher costs. The big challenge I fear that could come down the tracks very soon, and hopefully will be addressed in the spending review, is that the business rates reliefs that we've been able to apply this year are continued into next financial years, because we're already seeing businesses struggle to pay business rates. If we then have to go out next year, not just to bill them for business rates at the same levels, but at a much higher level, then I do fear that they may not be able to pay those bills. So it's something we need to keep a close eye on, really. Moving on then to, let's get this right. So that was announcements. Yeah, so now moving on to the forecast position for the next financial year. Obviously, we're now in the stage of the budget cycle where minds are switching very quickly to the budget from the 1st of April 21. But it's probably the most uncertain time in terms of doing this that myself, the team on the call, have ever encountered, and that's in substantial number of years doing this in Hackney. What we've tried to set out in the detailed committee report is our latest estimates at what we think, based upon the information we've received in terms of our income streams for the current financial year, so in terms of business rates, council tax, the additional spend that we can't see being turned off in the next financial year due to COVID, but also other challenges in terms of where we think we may be needing to continue to support things like the leisure industry and the like. We've come up with a range of scenarios which we've gone into detail in describing in the committee report that gives us a medium-term forecast at this stage that for the next financial year, even with a increase in council tax of 4%, which is our consistent planning assumption, we will be looking to find something of the order of £32 to £33 million for next year. Now, there have been a number of things that have moved since you saw the last medium-term forecast in detail when you agreed the budget for this year, and these are as follows, really. You'll see the pre-COVID forecast was at that point forecasting a shortfall of around £13 million. A big factor in that, of course, was expected loss of grant due to fairer funding. Now, we're now understanding that fairer funding won't be implemented for next financial year, which, as you'd expect, is is good news. What isn't clear yet, unfortunately, is what the overall size of local government cake will be, or whether fairer funding will be paused more permanently. We've also now aware that the business rates reset isn't taking place as well. But for me, when you look at these three forecasts, you can see just the range and the scale of it. And what I come on to show in the next slide are the sort of drivers that really are driving this budget position. So there's still a lot more work we need to continue to do on council tax. Now that people are able to get out more, we are seeing people who do pay in cash now being able to pay in cash again, which wasn't the case previously. But equally, we're also seeing that some people just aren't engaging with us as well. So we need to also look at how we can get that engagement improved. We're obviously very much aware of the impact that we're seeing on core funding. So particularly the business rates, revenue support grant aspect of that. And whilst we've taken a view about the smoothing of the collection fund deficit, there are a number of challenges in there. We also had some savings that we've been anticipating making in the current year, which hasn't been practicable to do. And there's always the ongoing uncertainty about how the New Homes Bonus grant will or will not continue, because the government had given an indication that New Homes Bonus, which we've been quite good and reasonable recipients of, would come to an end or be repurposed. The language wasn't entirely clear. So again, we've had to take some views in our forecasting there. But I think certainly for me and the team, and I'm sure Councillor Sharman, you'd echo this as well, that the detailed work we were able to do in our audit scrutiny task working group helped us get behind some of the detail of that, which ultimately went into the medium-term financial forecast report which you've got in the papers for tonight. So I can't see anyone signalling for any questions. I'll just move on to the next.
Can you just, I mean, what we haven't done, Ian, is talk at all about the HRA, either this year or next.
Yes, I can sort of give you an update on the housing revenue account, if that's helpful. So the latest pressures we've been forecasting on the housing revenue account were of the order of about £8 million all in. Now that was a combination of extra spend, but mainly it was forecast around loss of rental income, which is the big thing there. We're continuing to work very closely with colleagues in the housing in relation to some of that aspects of that forecast, because obviously a big be able to pay their rents if they've lost their jobs is actually getting them onto some form of benefits, be it principally universal credits, and making sure that that access and engagement's there. And that's where, again, the housing benefits team, we work very closely with colleagues in housing to get that early engagement, to get people who now are eligible for benefits to get those benefits. And so I'm due to do further work in the coming weeks on the housing revenue account in particular, as we'll get 4 months worth of housing rent data, but I would certainly be very happy to do a more detailed update on that to Audit Committee in September when we've got some more data, but also seen some of the impacts of and a better understanding of that transition to universal credit. You'll have all seen the article in one of the local papers in terms of, you know, the numbers of people moving on to UC soaring. What we need to make sure is that where they're eligible, they're getting benefits, and where they're getting the benefits, they obviously translate into us getting rental income.
Yeah, I think I certainly would like to see a section in our September report just picking up on Rebecca's point about keeping us informed in the updates on the HRA. I feel that's a bit, it touches so much on, as you say, rental payments and how that's doing. I do think we need to be absolutely clear that A, we're doing everything we can, and B, that how it's working.
We did have a section in the OFP report that went to what's in the papers for tonight on the housing revenue account, but I'm certainly happy to do a more detailed overview of that for our audit September meeting.
Yeah, well, just bring up to date on exactly, as you say, the interface between universal credit and rental payments, if that's the key issue, and how we're going to deal with the gap. Okay.
Great. So I'm just seeing if anyone else is signalling to.
No, I'm not getting any indication.
Great stuff. So that then, so Councillor Spencer asked the question: is HRA? It's appeared on the chat screen, disappeared. It is entirely ring fenced. So
we have to deal
HRA,
with it as a quasi-separate account. We need the kind of reassurance that can't just be buried in the general fund.
No, it has to balance.
Exactly. So that's why I think it would be helpful just to add to what you've got in this paper for September to see how it would.
I think for a sort of relative immediate assurance on that, it's probably worth just reminding ourselves that the housing revenue account budget does include quite a chunky revenue contribution to capital, particularly for financing the housing revenue account business model. Obviously, with the impact of a lot of this, it's meant a lot of works just haven't been able to happen in terms of particularly where the people, it's involved going into people's homes. So that in itself is often something that certainly in a shorter term can be used to mitigate any deficit on that HRA account. But obviously, you know, any capital works which were planned that don't happen ultimately do have to happen at some point, where it's in relation to repairs, maintenance, and just, you know, keeping things operational.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point, and it's getting the balance right between those. Yeah, Anna, you wanted to ask a question.
Thank you, Chair. I didn't realise myself, but unfortunately, I think next month the evictions ban is going to be lifted, and I just wondered whether or not we've mitigated for that there's probably a group of residents that may have not been paying their rent, have had a period of grace because obviously they've not had to be evicted, the landlords haven't been able to legally evict them, and I just wondered whether or not we're going to have quite distressing scenes, but also whether or not we've got capacity to potentially fund emergency housing for these residents.
I think that's one. Yeah.
I was going to say, shall I come in on that? I'm sure
Yeah.
Ian might want to come in on the finance side, but so to start with saying that we think the eviction ban should be extended further, but obviously we're in the position we're in at the moment. We've started to work, well, really encouraging residents to come and talk to us. Anyone that is struggling to pay their rent, to come and talk to us, both so that we can make sure that access to local housing allowance, the government has finally put back up. We put back up to 30%, not 50% of median rents, but we've been campaigning for a long time. We're going to move LHA back to the level. For those not familiar, LHA is housing benefit for the private rental sector, and we've been campaigning that it be returned to a level where you can actually afford to rent a property in Hackney. So there is much more benefit there than there was previously, and we can help with things like discretionary housing payments. But the key is people coming to talk to us as soon as possible. I'm really sorry I'm breaking up, Michelle. I don't know. The key is people coming to talk to us. Is a connection good enough for you, or is it cracking up completely?
No, I think just about. It is hard to follow, but I think we've got the sense of it. But I think that's an important issue, which again, when we come back in September, it'd be helpful just to sort of see where we are on that.
And the team very much are planning and anticipating that they can see an increase in approaches.
Yeah. Thanks, Rebecca. Ian, carry on.
So, moving us on then to the revised medium-term forecast beyond just next financial year, and this is probably one I'd say that is increasingly into the space of heavy degrees of uncertainty. There's an awful lot of now key policy decisions from government that have been continually kicked down the road for many years now. One being the obvious adult social care. Wasn't it only a year ago since the Prime Minister said something like need to fix social care? I suppose if there's ever going to be a moment for that to actually happen, and we have heard it in fairness from many governments for a long time, this probably is going to be one of those instances. And obviously that's the major area of expenditure for local authorities, certainly upper tier ones, and so obviously haven't been able to make any assumptions around a better funding settlement for adult social care. What we have been able to do is just plot our trajectories on the basis of best things that we know. Obviously have to still expect that fairer funding will happen beyond 21-22, albeit I think the realities of it being more phased in probably are becoming more likely. As I alluded to earlier, we've taken some judgments about the impact on of the collection fund deficits over those years. Obviously this is still in the absence now of whether anything different will come in as a package to assist councils in the way that sales fees and charges support has been brought in for the current year. No indication as to whether that would either continue into next year, though again, bits of detail that hopefully will come to fruition. And as I alluded to earlier, an interesting one that we're really keeping a real close eye on here is that it is not impossible that when we come to agree council tax for next year, because of the challenges with collection impacts there's been on the tax base, if you like, that even with a council tax bandy increase of around 4%, which is the planning assumption, it's not implausible that local authorities' council tax yield, so the amount it expects to collect in council tax. So in our case, the example I often use is it's not improbable that when we set council tax next year, that we will see the yield for next year actually being lower than what we were anticipating to collect for this current financial year in a pre-COVID world. I hope you managed to stick with me for that.
Yeah, got less money.
Yeah, but it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you would never, in a normal time, you would never expect to see increase in council tax bandy rate up, but actually your overall yield fall just because of the circumstances. Maybe a significant recession probably would be something in the non-COVID space that might challenge that. But yeah, but even that's not off the table at all, is it? It was been said. So I've got some slides really where we've done a bit more work just updating things on cash flow, and I think the point here was just to remind people that notwithstanding the pressures that we are seeing on income streams, we are still collecting a lot of money across the board. We are still seeing significant sums of money ultimately be paid, still not enough, but be paid to us from government. And so we have on a daily basis got significant sums of cash. So we're not in a situation where you know, we've got any worries about running out of cash. As I've summarised on the slide here, you know, as we sit here now, we've got £85 million of liquid cash and all the various investments that flow from that. And obviously we've got the flexibilities that still exist to fund capital through borrowing. Obviously it does attract, as any sort of debt does, the equivalent of a mortgage repayment is what I term it here. And we continue to look at any source of day-to-day borrowing as we've always done. And you know, this committee is very familiar, isn't it, with those detailed treasury management reports that Pradeep, Michael and the team often bring to this committee, and the many training sessions we've had as well. So in terms of next steps, which sort of captures, I think, Councillor Sharman, some of your earlier question and also the points you wanted to cover here. As I've said earlier, we're doing a lot of work with colleagues to really hone in on our use of agency and really being clear on that, doing reviews of where we've got vacant posts in the establishment, where we've got you know, challenges in terms of, you know, our roles, the sorts of roles we want to continue to recruit to, or do we need to repurpose some of those roles, rethink roles. Talked earlier about reviewing capital schemes. That detailed piece of work, which for me, real focus area on continuing to really bear down on some of those expenditure forecasts for the current year, but also to see is there more we can do to mitigate some of those losses of income. Continue to challenge the budget, essential spend, options development, and working hard to agree. We'll come on to it when we for the working group, I'm sure, next meet a draft budget timetable for next year, including process. Very important that staff engagement and resident engagement is at the heart of all this as well. Councillor Renison and I are doing another live stream event on Wednesday lunchtime with all staff, where we look to address and deal with the questions that they quite rightly are asking us in terms of the concerns that they have. As I mentioned earlier, you know, the final point there is the, you know, really positive work being done by that scrutiny and audit working group, looking at the financial challenges that we face. So I'll pause there for questions.
Great, thanks very much, Ian. I think that's more than fulfills what I was looking for, a reassurance on the cash issue. In other words, we can, as an audit committee, we have done everything we can to ensure there are no immediate issues around our solvency, but also how we're going to go about addressing the medium term, and we can focus it on the budget. And that's why I've been delighted that Rebecca has launched this joint executive and scrutiny and audit committee oversight of the process. And it might be helpful at this stage, Rebecca, just to say and to reassure the committee about how we're going about meeting that immediately 30 million potential challenge, in the long term maybe up to 50 million, how we're approaching that. And I guess the reassurance we need at this committee is that the executive both has got its arms around the size of the problem, and that's clearly been reassured by Ian's paper. Now, how are we going to plan to deal with it? And it'd be really helpful to say a little bit about that, because we've had a series of meetings which you've chaired very helpfully, and how we're now planning to go ahead would be, I think, good to share with the committee.
Let's see if my internet connection holds up, and I'm also now competing with a very noisy neighbour's dog, so we'll see. Start waving at me if I cut out and you can't hear me.
You sound fine at the moment.
I'll try and be quick. Yeah, so this is so going back about 2 months ago now, we decided we wanted, there's a desire to start working, things are moving so quickly, we wanted to work more directly with scrutiny and audit, rather than members having to wait to come and formally report, to have more of those conversations earlier on. And so we've had a working group going with panel from Audit Committee, who've been working with us on the papers tonight and inputting into those. Very clear that this is still the best way to phrase it, executive-led, but with audit and scrutiny input, as in you can still call us audit and scrutiny, bill us everything else. It's engagement, not endorsement, I think, phrase I was using, it wasn't it? That's it.
Yeah, that's right.
So, you know, all that scrutiny function is still intact. It's just making sure there's that earlier oversight. That's proved hugely useful. And so what we're looking at now is how we keep that going as we go into the budget. I think one of the things we're all very aware of is that looking at that sort of more medium-term financial challenge and moving into next year is that we need to get an early start on the budget process. And I suppose just to reassure members that we'll be working with audit and scrutiny for that level oversight, but well aware that as ideas start to come together for the next financial year, that might then lead into relevant scrutiny functions, take forward pieces of work, as finished groups. So we're in no way taking anything out of scrutiny's domain or control, or audit's domain or control. We're just trying to provide a little bit more transparency and a little bit more access to the behind the scenes workings as we go. It's hugely useful so far, and hopefully continue to be so. And does that sort of sum up for you, Nick, where you feel we're up to?
I just want to offer the committee, obviously, a chance to comment on, because my accountability is back to the committee, but they need to know how that fits into the wider framework. And thanks for that. Any questions on that process? Good. Yes, Michelle seems happy with it. Well, as a participant too, because Michelle has been active on that group as well. And certainly, I think the challenge, Rebecca, is going to come now, because you're absolutely right. We need to do things now if we're going to be effective next year and come to a view. And the problem I see is this clash of the government on the one hand saying that it's unlikely to finance all our gaps, and yet what we've uncovered as in the corporate plan rewriting or the relook at the corporate plan are two things. One is that our priorities are broadly right, but we've uncovered further needs as a result of this process. And so we've got, in a sense, finding deeper and wider needs in a situation where we've got less and less resource. And I think, and so we've got, in a sense, finding deeper and wider needs in a situation where we've got less and less resource. And I think, you know, that's the kind of terrain that we really have to tackle in the autumn to see how we can do something about that and how we can bring those two together.
And it's right, and it's no accident that we published the corporate plan update along with the medium-term financial plan, because it is right that our focus and priorities stay what is best for residents, and that we work out with the finances we have how we best deliver that, and that we don't lose sight, we don't become so focused on how we balance the book, we lose sight of what's best for Hackney and Hackney's residents. So hence having those two side by side, and it's why it will need to be, and you're right, the challenge, we've not got just financial uncertainty going into this budget process, changes in how people are accessing, demanding and need in the borough at the same time. So a huge number of unknowns and rapidly changing landscape. So all of that and a challenging budget is going to be a intense 6 months or so ahead of us as we go through that.
Yeah. And just to emphasise, our job as Audit Committee is not to is to make sure that those plans are in place. Scrutiny and the executive are clearly responsible for the political choices that need to be made. Great, Anna, you were indicating. Were you?
Yes, sorry. No, I just wanted to say to Rebecca, I think it is really good that we are taking like a sort of holistic approach to all of this, because I think there is a tendency to panic slightly, but actually, which isn't going to help. But also, I think it is the approach we're taking, and I agree with what you said about the corporate plan as well. But I guess there's always something around us politically around how it impacts on our manifesto commitments as well. So it is useful to do that as well, because you have to remain focused on what the residents' needs are, but which I think will help when we have to potentially look at things in difficult things further on, if we've had that approach at the beginning that we're going to be, you know, look at it holistically, and we're going to be transparent as well with what we're doing as well. So I think the stuff that you're doing with Ian, with having those regular calls as well, I think really with the staff is really useful as well, definitely.
And it's some of the unpredictable nature of the situation we find ourselves in that some parts of the manifesto have almost been sort of turbocharged by this. So there's pieces of work or projects that's been tended to forward for a while and hit barriers and encountered difficulties that have, you know, moved ahead. And then, yeah, there's other bits where there's quite practical challenges put in the way by COVID-19. So again, it just reflects the huge number of variables that we now have to juggle.
Great. I think, or any other member want to come in? This is going to be the task of the autumn, because we've got to do this in a measured way, as I think you're suggesting, Anna, but we've sure got to get on with it, because the longer we don't make these choices, the harder they will be down the track. Well, I'm not seeing any other indications, so Ian, thanks very much, you and staff. I see thanks for being expressed to the. I think that I've been really reassured by the way that the finance staff have come up with these numbers and given me certainly a sense of confidence. And I think the committee that we are on top insofar as we can be in a very uncertain situation. We're as on top of the numbers as we can be. So if that thanks can be passed on, that'd be good. Great. Okay, now we move on to the other subsection of this. Well, it's a separate item here, which is the audit of accounts, and why we've not been able, as we'd hoped at the last meeting, to complete the audit by now, and how we're now going to go ahead. So, Ian, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, sure. So hopefully the slide has appeared. I didn't realise it's only got 13 slides, so unlucky, hopefully not going to be unlucky for us. But what we've tried to do here is just give you a quick update on where we are with the accounts closure and the audit. I mean, it probably goes without saying that, you know, the times we're working in are probably some of the most extraordinary of that any of us have encountered, and I think that's been the case not just for the Hackney Council staff, but I also know from discussions with the auditors as well. So welcome Stuart and Lucy to the call. It's brought about some real challenges for them in terms of doing their work, and obviously they work in a way that often requires them to do the NHS audits in the early part of the sort of the new financial year, if you like, and then move on to local authority audits. Obviously the NHS bit took longer, was more difficult, so they had issues to deal with there. But I think also the regulatory and reporting requirements around audits for the public and private sector continue to evolve in the sort of certainly not a post-COVID world, is it, in the next phase of COVID. So you'll all recall from our last meeting that the government very early on gave the extension to local authorities to not need to publish their accounts until the 31st of August 2020, and then to have them audited by the 30th of November 2020. We were always keen to get the accounts done as quickly as we could. Whilst we weren't quite as quick as we wanted to have been, I think in the circumstances, and having seen when other local authorities have since published or still are to publish their accounts, I think the team's done a fantastic job getting to that stage, particularly with some of that last stage. It is much harder working remotely on some of the things, because when you can't just talk to people in the office as easily. But we published our draft accounts middle of June, and the audit had already started, as you were aware from the last committee meeting, and has been progressing well. So in terms of where we are, the Mazars team, this is following meetings they've been having with us on a weekly basis, as you'd expect, and at this time, aim to substantially complete by the middle of August. And finance teams are working closely with them to get this to that place. There is a real focus on COVID. I won't try and compete with that motorbike. There is a real focus on COVID impact on finances, and in particular understanding whether councils satisfy that test of a going concern. And I just remind people that if they're not familiar with it, is when an auditor signs off their opinion, they have to give that sort of assurance around, and they have to be satisfied that the organisation will be a going concern a year from that date, and that's something which obviously is particularly important. Other things which are still being progressed, not so much of an issue in Hackney, but there's still ongoing discussions and challenges with regards to those local authorities that have accrued substantial dedicated schools grant deficits, particularly in relation to SEND. for some, it's causing them some real challenges with their auditors, particularly where it's a significant deficit and where they don't have anything equivalent to it in their general reserves. As you know, we've got some subsidiary companies through some of the housing schemes. We've progressed. The audit on that is also progressing well. And without wishing to tempt fate with it being slide 13, we are still working hard to provisionally get, subject to your approval, Councillor Sharman, the Special Audit Committee in September to sign off the accounts, and I think we've got a date now, around about the 14th seems to be what's coming forward from committee services. So I won't say any more there unless Michael or James, do you want to chip in with anything, or are you happy with that?
Yeah, I'm looking at Michael and James to see if they've got anything to add to that process.
No, I think that generally sums up the position. I think the work that auditors are currently doing as well is focusing on valuations of property, plant and equipment, which are obviously affected by COVID, and some of the pensions, liabilities and assets. So they're the two particular ones which I think have made the audit a bit more extended. I'm sure.
Which is reassuring that our basic management accounts seem sound, which is always in terms of simple income and expenditure, so more sort of balance type item.
Indeed, yeah.
A question from Michelle, I think.
Hi, I assume that most of the potential reduction in valuations will be next financial year rather than this financial year. But how does that affect this year's audit if we're looking at a likely reduction in the value of some of our assets, or is that something we'll factor into the next year's audit? Thanks.
Yeah, well, some of the asset values are based on rental values, etc., and obviously the rental value, so that can impact on value as at 31st of March for our accounts. So that's one of the reasons why the PPE is the property, plant and equipment is actually needs more assurance around it.
Okay, Brian, you wanted to come in.
I know this is mainly a question for pensions, but I'm getting a lot of anecdotal evidence of people opting to take early retirement because they're unhappy with the new working methods. Are you getting a lot of requests for that?
Who's going to field that one?
So, Councillor Bell, I think I heard the whole question. Could you just repeat it, just so I don't go off on a wrong tangent?
I'm getting some anecdotal reports of a lot of staff, long-serving staff, looking at early retirement as an option because they don't like the new working arrangements.
As in due to the COVID, as in the working from home, or the...
Yeah, that broadly, yeah.
Obviously, we did have the council's voluntary redundancy scheme, which was concluded well before the pandemic outbreak, and of which a number of people did elect to go voluntarily. In some cases, that was on in relation to early retirement, but it wasn't. The distribution from recollection was broadly about 50-50, wasn't it, in terms of the split between those who were eligible to go on retirement as opposed to on redundancy, which is about consistent with where we've been before. There are a whole range of things out there that I've heard, not necessarily in Hackney, but speak to colleagues in some other boroughs. They have seen more interest expressed by people to retire. I think there's people have concerns about wanting to draw down their pensions and things. But of course, you know as well as anyone that actually, yes, if you're over a certain age, you can opt to retire, but that doesn't mean it doesn't come without, well, particularly if it's not a voluntary redundancy situation, it then if you like, the actuarial strain cost, so substantially would reduce potentially a pension, wouldn't it, with that case? I'm not inundated with requests for early retirement. I don't think Michael or the team's been, have you?
So something to keep an eye on, perhaps, Brian. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, leave it at that.
Yeah, great. Lucy, any comments you want to make, in terms of how the work's going, whether you can reassure us that late August date is still your target, and just points generally about what you can say about our current financial situation.
Thank you, Chair. I don't really have a huge amount to add. I think Ian and Michael have summed up the process fairly well. There's two really big reasons that we're unable to present accounts tonight, and that is, as we're talking about the land and building valuations, this is a national issue. It is not a Hackney specific issue. It is all local authorities having this issue. We're having to do a lot more work around the land and building valuations, which is taking time. And we've kind of alluded to the challenges of remote working. It's just not always quite as quick. And the second reason is that the Hackney has material pension liabilities in the London Pension Fund. And for that, we get assurance from the London Pension Fund auditor every year. And they've indicated that they won't be able to give us assurances until mid to late August. So that's another reason that we were unable to come with complete accounts this evening. So we're looking to do that in September, and I think, I'll take this opportunity to add my thanks to the list of everyone else's, to Michael, James and the finance team who've been working really hard to get us all the information that we've needed. It was a good set of accounts that we got, and really limited comments on them, I would say, having seen another few in the last few weeks. And I think, remote auditing, it's had challenges, but I think the finance team have really helped and they've really responded to them. So thank you to them. And we'll continue to plough on in the next few weeks, and we'll see you back in September.
Great stuff. Okay, well, I mean, I'm okay for September the 14th, but I see, Michelle, it might be difficult for that. So if you can pencil it in for the 14th, and if we can find another date adjacent to it, which works from a council point of view, we'll try and accommodate our vice chair. But if that's not possible, that's not possible. I think we've got to get in that week, it seems to me, for all the reasons that we've been going through earlier. The financial situation is really important to keep an eye on over the next months. Great. Okay. Well, thanks all, and look forward to the accounts coming back in early September. And the last item on the agenda I've got is the capital programme deep dive. The concern there was that our oversight of revenue is, I think, always been very sound and consistent. Our oversight of capital has uncovered the varied way that some of the estimates and oversight, particularly in the department of the capital programme, needs looking at. So, Ian, do you want to give us a sort of a quick summary of the proposed deep dive brief that
sure. So members will have. Can I present it? Shall we do that? So members will have had copies of the terms of reference. So what we've looked to do here is build upon now this will be our third or fourth deep dive, I think, won't it, Councillor Sharman? Yeah. So building on the really good work we've had in relation to this, going back to when we started on SEND, is look at another area that is obviously of real importance for us. And so, whilst the Audit Committee has been receiving via the OFP, via the Capital Programme Update Report, etc., updates on the Capital Programme, it wanted to look a bit more closely at some of those assumptions that the service, what I call the service spending departments, are making, that often require us to make quite a number of financial adjustments in year in relation to those forecasts. And so, what we're going to propose, subject to tonight's discussion, is effectively a number of pieces of work, develop a better understanding of how some of those department forecasts are made. So, for instance, how best practice is applied to the development and forecast for the programme. Do a bit more work on the budget monitoring process of the programme and how budget holders feed into the finance teams with regards to that. Develop a real understanding of the different types of capital programmes we've got in Hackney. So there's a very big difference, isn't there, between, say, the highways maintenance programme that Andy and his team oversee to, let's say, Chris, Jane and the team in terms of building new council houses. We've identified here a range of participants, contributors, for want of a better word, that comprise all of the various areas of the council's activities in this space. and also we'll try and see if there's anyone we can get in from outside to do a bit of is there any other best practice out there? I think from my experience, councils have and often do struggle with capital planning and profiling in particular, and things, as we know from a number of schemes, things do slip, events happen. But I think if we can learn any lessons, that would be useful. But I also think it should be quite an interesting session to see for this committee to get a better understanding of just the scale and the volume of investments that we've been making now, not just for the last year, but now getting on for the past decade or so. So I'll pause there for breath.
No, I think that summarised it very well. And just to emphasise that final point you've made, capital is now a very substantial part of our of what the council does. And as we move into more risky areas, both on the borrowing and on the expenditure side, it's going to be more and more important that we manage this in a much closer way than the traditional in local authorities. I don't think we're worse than any other local authority. I just think in local authority terms, they've not been as good as other agencies in managing capital. So I do think we are trying to move us into a new era. So I'd like to appeal to people. We'll set up to participate in this. I think it's an important area, and we'll set up in our usual way a meeting in which we'll take witnesses and come to a view as we have in the past, I think quite successfully. So any comments from members on that sort of on the area? Good. Oh, a compliment from Michelle. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think yes, I'm getting no dissent. So let's take that then as read, and we'll try and set something up. Ian, have you got any diary dates that we might do an initial kind of first go through with some witnesses about how we do it?
We've Joe's just doing the usual fielding for dates at the moment, so we should have some very soon, I hope.
Great stuff. Good. Okay. Well, I think we're almost done. Any other business that anyone wants to raise? Excellent. Well, thanks very much to all. I'm really delighted we've tackled that issue of that oversight of the financial situation of the council. I think we cannot underestimate how big a task we've got ahead. Well, the executive has in the immediate side, but the council as a whole in confronting it. So I'm delighted the leadership's being shown and that we're part of that. So thanks to all, and those of us who are having any sort of holiday, have a good one, and see you in September. Yeah.